Today I'm going to be making a simple quilt for the baby's room. It's mountain themed, and this is the pattern that I created that it's going to look like. It's going to have squares that go along the edges, some longer rectangular pieces at the top and bottom, and then it's going to have a big rectangle in the middle with a mountain seam on it. So because the baby's blanket is going to be 40 inches by 26 inches, that's just the dimensions that I chose. This is what it's going to look like dimension-wise. The little squares on the side are going to be 8 inches tall by 6 inches wide. The longer pieces are going to be 14 inches by 8 inches, and the middle part is going to be 24 inches by 14 inches. Now, to make this simple, I numbered the fabric. These are the 4 different fabrics that I'm going to use for the squares and rectangles around the edges, so I've numbered them. And then I also put underneath them how many of each one I'm going to need. I'm going to need 4 of those, 2 of this one, and 2 of this one. And it correlates to this. So fabric number 1, that's over here, will go where you see number 1. Boom, 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 boom. Fabric number 2 will go here. Boom, da, da, da. And then fabric number 3 is going to go in these 2 spots. And fabric number 4 is going to be my long rectangles. This middle section here is going to be all white, which is the fabric I have there. And then the gray fabric that you see next to it is going to be my mountains. And then I also made this little thing right here. It's 8 inches by 6 inches. It's just a piece of cardstock paper that I cut off in those dimensions because that's what size my little squares are going to be. So I'm going to use that to set on my fabric to simply cut it out so that they're all the same size. Okay, got all my 8 by 6 inch squares cut. Now I'm going to cut out the bigger pieces of fabric, the mountains and the white part. Got the mountain seam cut out. Now I'm going to piece everything together so we can see what the quilt will look like. Now we're going to start sewing the pieces together. So we're going to look at our diagram again, and I apologize, my son colored on it, but we're going to sew all these pieces together going down and all of these pieces together going down. So I'm going to grab my first 2 pieces. I've got them in 2 piles for each line of fabric. I'm going to grab my first 2, and you're going to put them right sides together. So this is the correct side, this is the correct side, like this. So the outside is going to be the back of the fabric, and you're just going to sew a straight line across. So this is done. So when you open it up, it looks like this. I'm just going to grab my next one, and all you do is then put it on top of this one, and I'm going to sew this part here so that it then folds down, and it'll be like that. And then we just do that till they're all attached. So I'm going to finish this row, and then I'm going to sew the next row together. And I'm sewing about, I'd say about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom. Just got done sewing these 2 lines. Now I'm going to work on sewing the mountains onto the white fabric. First thing I'm going to do is just sew a straight line all the way down the edge of this to connect the bottom of the mountain piece to the white fabric. Now I'm going to take my mountains, and I'm going to sew a zigzag stitch along the mountain like this on all the peaks and pointy parts to attach it completely to the white fabric. And I switched my thread out to gray thread because since the thread is going to be on top of the gray fabric, you're going to see it. I'm slowing it down for just a second to make sure it's very clear on what I'm doing here. I'm sewing the zigzag along the edge of the mountain, and it's going from the white and onto the gray. So all of the stitching that you see is actually on the gray, not on the white. So I stitch my zigzag down. When I get to the end, I lift this up, and then I swivel it around, set it down, and then I start zigzagging back up this way. got the mountain seam sewed on. You can see on here where I stitched, it goes on the gray fabric. Now I just quickly ironed both of the long pieces that we sewed earlier because these seams, if you iron them down flat, they're much easier to sew over when we attach this to the big part of our fabric that has the mountain seams on them. So now what I'm gonna do is take my long piece and I'm gonna sew from top to bottom. So I wanna make sure that what I ironed is pointing down, not up. So this is pointing down. I'm going to turn it right sides in towards each other. And I'm gonna line this up and I'm gonna pin it in place. I don't like to use pins a lot, but for this I am gonna pin it because some things it's hard to eyeball. So now our side pieces are sewn on. Now we're gonna sew the top pieces of fabric here and the bottom piece of fabric down there. We have our bottom part sewed on now and our top part. So now what we're gonna do is the pieces that extend up here, we're gonna fold them over. We're gonna put them right sides together like we did earlier, and we're gonna sew down that edge there. The front of the baby quilt is now finished, so I'm gonna go iron it, and then I'm gonna work on putting the middle batting and the back section on. Now that I've got my quilt ironed and all the seams completely flat, I'm gonna cut the middle layer and the back layer. The middle layer is just gonna be this solid white fleece. I've started using fleece when I make baby blankets and little quilts because it's significantly cheaper than batting, and I actually really like the feel and the fluffiness that it gives to the blanket. So that's gonna be the batting layer, and then the back layer is just gonna be more of this gray fabric. It's just gonna be solid gray. We're keeping it really, really simple to get it done quickly. So I'm gonna lay these underneath the quilt and get both of those cut. Now it's cut out and I have all three layers stacked on top of each other. We've got our top quilt layer, we've got the middle layer to actually provide the warmth, and then we've got the back of the blanket. You want the good side of the fabric to be out. So the good side of the fabric on the bottom and the good side of the fabric on the top. Because what we're gonna do now is I'm just gonna add a couple of pins. I hate pinning. I feel like it's a waste of time when I sew. And I know a lot of professional sewers would be like, oh my gosh, but I don't know, my grandma never used pins when she taught me to sew, and I've just learned to eyeball everything and hold it in place. But anyway, I'm gonna add a couple of pins. Okay, my pins are holding it in place. So now all I'm gonna do is take it over to my sewing machine and I'm gonna sew a straight line all the way around the edge of the whole entire blanket to sew it all together. And if you see here, they don't line up perfectly, that's okay, because our trim piece is gonna come out and cover over this. So you just wanna make sure that you sew along that fabric line. And that's done, it's sewed together. I'll show you up close here. You can see where we sewed it together. So now all I'm gonna do is kind of go through and trim up these edges a little bit. Honestly, you can skip this part if you want to, but I like to kind of even out those edges a little bit. Next, we're gonna make the trim pieces that go around the edging of the quilt. For the edging fabric, I'm gonna use this white fabric, and what we're gonna do is cut strips the length of the blanket all the way down that are about maybe 6.5 inches wide, and that's what we're gonna fold over to make the trim on that blanket. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna fold the fabric in half, and we're going to iron a seam on it, and you want the right sides to be out. So you can see that it's folded in half here. We have our crease from where we ironed it. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna set this on there, just like this, and we're gonna sew a straight line all the way down, And then when we're done sewing, we will be able to flip this over and it'll have a finished edge and we can attach it around the back. And that makes our edging. So what I'm gonna do though is I'm gonna flip this over and actually sew it on that side. That way I can see where this line is and I can sew right on the line or on the inside, because if you sew on the outside, that thread is gonna show up here on the front. If you do that, it'll fold over and then you'll be able to see that sewing line. You don't wanna see that sewing line. Now, if you want to, you can pin this in place, but I find it always easier just to eyeball it because you can see a little bit of your black there on the edge. So I sewed on the sides. Now when I cut my black things, I cut them all the exact same length, and obviously the top and the bottom are not near as long as the sides. So what you're gonna do is you want to purposefully overlap this like this with your extra fabric when you sew it on, because you'll need this extra fabric to finish your endings that we're gonna sew by hand, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Got the edging finished and sewed on there. Turned out great. Now we're going to work on finishing sewing the edging. And this part I actually do by hand. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna do the two sides first. You'll do the top and the bottom last, and I'll show you why. If you flip it over, you'll see here the unfinished end on the back. The front has a nice finished end from where it's sewn on there. So you flip it over, you're gonna take this side piece and you're gonna fold it over like this. And then, where it is right there, you're gonna hand stitch along this all the way down from top to bottom, making sure that you cover up this seam so you do not see anything. You go down like this, and then you go over to the black part and you go through that corner as well. And you just keep going like that all the way down. It's a little time consuming, but it's pretty relaxing. And that way, if you sew it like this, you don't actually see any thread because of how it pulls together. Okay, got the first side done, but that's what it looks like. So it gives you that nice thin trim. And then on the back, because we have sewn it by hand, you don't see any stitching. If we were to sew this by a sewing machine, we would have to sew on this line and it would go all the way through to the other side and you would see the thread. But because we did it by hand, 100% of the thread is hidden, which is really nice. So now the only thing we have left is to sew the top, bottom, and the corners. For the corners, this is the side here that we already had flipped over and sewn. This is our extra fabric here. What we're gonna do is cut off that fabric to where we have about a 1/2 inch extra. Excuse the background noise. I have my little helper here playing with Play-Doh next to me. So once you cut off the extra fabric, what we're gonna do is there's this unfinished end here. You fold that under a little bit like that, about 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and then that sits along here. Then what you're gonna do is fold this end like that, and then you fold it in half, just like we did the sides. Then you're gonna stitch along this to put that together, and then you flip it over and you stitch along the back all the way across, just like we did on the sides, to cover up those seams. All the corners are finished and all the trim is done. The final and last step is that we just have to stitch some of the top all the way through to the bottom so that it doesn't come apart. Because right now you can see the quilt can be pulled apart front to back. So we need to go through and stitch all the way through all 3 layers to hold it together. Some people would go through and stitch it a lot. They would stitch zigzags all the way across like a couple hundred times. I'm gonna do this really simple. I'm just gonna outline basically this little part right here in white thread. So what I ended up doing was going around the edges here about an 1/8 inch in, and I sewed a seam along everything white that you see here. I really like the detailing that I added. And then I did the same thing around the mountains by sewing about an 1/8 inch seam with white thread. Just adds a little bit of dimension to the quilt, and then it obviously helps hold it together. And then if you flip it over, because I used white thread, it's actually pretty cute. You can see the mountains. And I just painted the little white mountain peaks on there. I just used fabric paint. It was so easy. But it's finally done. I got the finished quilt up here in the baby's nursery. Turned out so cute and it matches so well. And when I finally get the nursery finished, I will post the video link for the nursery video in the description.